The old monk sat quietly on the wooden porch of the monastery, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The golden light bathed the temple walls in a warm glow, while the distant sound of temple bells echoed softly through the valley. The scent of blooming jasmine filled the evening air, bringing a sense of peace. His face, weathered by time, held a calmness that seemed unshakable, as if nothing in the world could disturb the deep serenity within him. From the stone path below, hurried footsteps approached. A young man, no older than his mid-20s, climbed the monastery steps. His eyes carried the weight of frustration and confusion. He had traveled far, seeking wisdom, seeking answers. He knelt before the monk, bowing respectfully, but his voice trembled with urgency. "Master," he began, his breath uneven. "I don't understand. No matter how hard I try, I always feel hurt by others. Their words, their actions, they affect me deeply. Sometimes I feel like I have no control over my own peace. I get angry, I get sad, and it feels like I'm trapped in my own emotions. But you sit here so calm, so unaffected. Please, tell me, how can I be like you?" The monk opened his eyes, meeting the young man's desperate gaze. He had heard these words before, many times, from many people. He smiled, not out of amusement, but with the kindness of one who had once asked the very same questions. "My child," he said gently, "there was a time when I, too, was easily troubled by the world around me. Harsh words wounded me. Anger consumed me. I felt powerless against my own emotions. But through years of practice, I have learned 10 powerful lessons that changed everything." The young man leaned in, eager to listen. The monk continued, his voice steady and warm. "These lessons taught me how to remain calm in the face of insults, detach from negativity, and find strength even in the most difficult moments. When I first learned them, I thought they were simple. But in time, I realized they were the key to true freedom, the kind of freedom that no one can take away from you." The monk paused, letting his words settle. Then, he gestured toward an old wooden bench beside him. "Come," he said, "sit with me, and I will share my story with you. Perhaps within it, you will find the answers you seek." The young man hesitated for a moment, then slowly took a seat. The sun had fully set, now, and the sky was a deep shade of blue, sprinkled with the first stars of the evening. The air was still, as if the universe itself had paused to listen. Before we begin, I invite you to reflect on your own journey. Have you ever felt hurt by someone's words or actions? Have you struggled to control your emotions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear your experiences. And if you find this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support this channel. Together, we can spread wisdom and inner peace. Now, let us begin. Part 1. Turning insults into opportunities. The young man sat eagerly, his eyes fixed on the old monk, waiting for his first lesson. The monk took a deep breath and began. "Many years ago, when I was still a young monk, I encountered a man who despised me for no reason. He was a wealthy merchant, full of pride, and he saw monks like me as nothing more than beggars who contributed nothing to society. One day, as I walked through the village, he stood before me and spat words of insult. He called me useless, lazy, and foolish for wasting my life in a monastery." The young man furrowed his brows. "What did you do?" he asked. "Did you defend yourself?" The monk smiled. "At that time, I felt anger rising within me. My pride wanted to argue, to prove my worth. But then, I remembered the teachings of the Buddha. Instead of reacting with anger, I paused and asked myself, what can I learn from this?" The young man leaned forward, listening intently. I realized that his insults were not truly about me. They were a reflection of his own struggles. his own ignorance. So instead of feeling hurt, I used that moment as an opportunity to practice patience, to strengthen my inner peace, and to deepen my understanding of human nature. The monk looked at the young man and asked, "Tell me, if someone offers you a gift, but you do not accept it, who does the gift belong to?" The young man thought for a moment. "To the one who offered it, I suppose." The monk nodded. "Exactly. The same is true for insults. If you do not accept them, they do not belong to you. They remain with the person who spoke them." The young man's face softened, as if a weight had lifted from his heart. Application in life. The next time someone insults you, take a deep breath. Do not react immediately. Instead, ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Maybe it is a chance to practice patience. Maybe it is a reminder not to let others control your emotions. Lesson to remember. Insults only hurt if you choose to receive them. Let them pass, and they lose their power over you. The monk smiled. Are you ready for the next lesson? Part 2. Never let others' words control your emotions. The young man sat in deep thought, still absorbing the lesson about insults. The old monk let a moment of silence pass before speaking again. "There was another time," he began, "when I was falsely accused of something I did not do. A villager's daughter had disappeared, and in their desperation, the people began to whisper. Someone pointed at me, saying that I must have had something to do with it. Soon, the entire village was speaking against me." The young man's eyes widened. "What did you do? Were you angry?" The monk shook his head. "At first, I felt an urge to defend myself. My heart ached at the thought of being misunderstood. But then I asked myself, does my peace depend on what others say?" He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "I knew the truth. I had done nothing wrong. And I realized that my peace should not be placed in the hands of others. If I had allowed their words to control me, I would have suffered unnecessarily. So, I remained calm. I continued my daily practice, meditating, and helping those in need. A few days later, the missing girl was found in a neighboring village. The accusations faded, and those who had spoken against the monk felt ashamed. Some came to apologize, but he held no resentment. "You see," the monk said, "people will always have opinions. Some will praise you, some will criticize you. If you let their words decide your emotions, you will forever be at their mercy." The young man nodded slowly. Application in life. The next time someone criticizes you, pause and ask yourself, does this define who I am? If the words are true, use them to improve yourself. If they are false, let them pass like the wind. Lesson to remember. Your peace is yours to protect. Never hand it over to others. The monk smiled. Are you ready for the next lesson? Part 3. Demand excellence from yourself. Offer grace to others. The young man shifted on the bench, eager for the next lesson. The old monk smiled and began. Many years ago, when I was still training as a young monk, I had a fellow disciple named Jiro. He was kind-hearted but often careless. During our morning rituals, he would sometimes forget the chants or misplace sacred texts. The elders grew frustrated with him, and even I found myself annoyed at times. The young man nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. One day, Jiro was assigned to prepare tea for the monastery's guests. In his usual absent-mindedness, he spilled an entire pot of tea on the abbot's robe. Everyone gasped, expecting harsh punishment. The monk paused, his eyes twinkling. But instead of scolding him, the abbot simply said, "Jiro, let's try again, this time with more care." The young man tilted his head. He wasn't punished. The monk shook his head. The abbot understood that growth takes time. Mistakes are not failures. They are part of learning. That day, I realized something important. The monk continued. I had always been strict with myself, holding myself to high standards. But I had also expected the same from others, which only led to frustration. The truth is, we should strive for excellence in ourselves, but we must offer patience and grace to others. They are walking their own path, just as we are. The young man exhaled, as if releasing a burden he didn't realize he had been carrying. Application in life. Hold yourself accountable to do your best in all things, but don't expect others to match your pace. Instead of frustration, offer understanding. Lesson to remember. Be disciplined with yourself, but gentle with others. Growth happens at different speeds for everyone. The monk smiled. Shall we continue? Part 4. See every interaction as a lesson. The young man sat quietly, reflecting on the previous lesson. The old monk let a moment pass before continuing. There was a time, he said, when I believed wisdom could only be learned from great teachers. But life itself is the greatest teacher of all, if we are willing to learn. The young man listened intently as the monk began his story. One morning, as I walked through the marketplace, I saw a small child crying. He had dropped his toy into a puddle, and to him, it felt like the end of the world. His mother knelt beside him, wiped his tears, and said, "My child, this is nothing to be upset about. You can always clean it or find another toy." The young man smiled slightly. Later that same day, the monk continued, I met an old farmer whose crops had been destroyed by a storm. He sat outside his home staring at the ruined fields. When I approached him, he sighed and said, "Such is life. We must start again." The monk paused. 2 people, 2 losses, but 2 very different reactions. The young man furrowed his brows. So, what was the lesson? The child saw his loss as unbearable because he had not yet learned perspective. The monk explained. The farmer, through years of hardship, had learned to accept impermanence. That day, I learned that suffering is not caused by what happens to us, but by how we choose to see it. Application in life. Every person you meet, whether kind or unkind, wise or foolish, has something to teach you. Observe, reflect, and grow. Lesson to remember. Every interaction holds a lesson. The question is, are you willing to learn? The monk smiled. Are you ready for the next teaching? Part 5. Emotions are temporary. The young man shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful. The old monk let the silence settle before beginning his next story. Many years ago, the monk said, I had a dear friend named Hiroshi. He was a fellow monk, full of life and laughter. We trained together, shared meals, and discussed philosophy late into the night. But one winter, Hiroshi fell ill. Despite our efforts to care for him, he passed away. The young man lowered his eyes. That must have been painful. The monk nodded gently. It was. I grieved deeply. 4 days. My heart ached, and I felt as though the sorrow would never leave me. He paused, then continued. But one morning, as I sat by the river, I watched the water flowing past. A single leaf drifted on the surface, caught in the current, spinning for a moment before floating away. And I realized, emotions are just like that leaf. They appear, they swirl around us, and then they pass. The young man looked up, listening carefully. At that moment, I understood. The monk said, no matter how intense an emotion feels, whether it is grief, anger, or fear, it will not stay forever. The same way joy comes and goes, so does sadness. If we cling to emotions, we suffer. But if we simply observe them, like watching the river flow, we find peace. Application in life. When sadness, anger, or fear arises, remind yourself, This feeling is temporary. Do not resist it, but also do not hold on to it. Let it come. Let it go. Lesson to remember. Emotions are like passing clouds. Observe them, but do not become them. The monk smiled. Shall we continue? Part 6. Become emotionally invincible. The young man took a deep breath, letting the previous lesson settle in. The old monk watched him with a knowing smile. Tell me, the monk said, have you ever felt betrayed? The young man clenched his jaw. Yes, by someone I trusted. The monk nodded. Then you will understand this story. He leaned back and began. Many years ago, I had a student, one I cared for deeply. He trained under me for several seasons, and I shared with him everything I knew. But one day, he left the monastery and spoke against me in the village. He told lies, twisting my words, turning people against me. The young man frowned. That must have hurt. The monk nodded. It did. At first, I felt anger, then sadness. But then I asked myself, if I allow his actions to disturb my peace, am I not giving him power over me? The young man's expression shifted as he processed the question. That was the day I realized, the monk continued, that no one, not a betrayer, not an enemy, not even a loved one, can truly hurt me unless I allow them to. He pointed toward the ground. A storm may shake the trees, but it cannot move the mountain. If your mind is steady, nothing outside of you can break you. Application in life. When someone betrays or hurts you, pause and ask yourself, why should I give them control over my emotions? Instead of reacting, choose peace. Lesson to remember. No one can hurt you unless you let them. Be the mountain, not the tree. The monk smiled. Are you ready for the next lesson? Part 7. Master the art of acceptance. The young man exhaled slowly, letting the monk's words settle in his heart. The old teacher smiled, then gazed toward the distant mountains. Life does not always go as we wish, the monk said softly. But peace comes when we stop resisting what is. The young man tilted his head. What do you mean? The monk began his story. Years ago, a great storm struck our monastery. The winds howled through the valley. The rain fell without mercy. By morning, the temple garden, one we had cultivated for decades, was destroyed. Trees uprooted. Flowers washed away. Years of careful tending undone in a single night. The young man's brows furrowed. That must have been devastating. The monk nodded. At first, yes, many of the monks were heartbroken. Some were angry at nature. Others despaired at the loss. But our abbot simply looked at the ruins and said, the storm has done its work. Now, we begin again. The young man blinked. He wasn't upset. No, the monk replied, because he understood that fighting reality only brings suffering. The storm had come. The garden was gone. No amount of anger or sadness could change that. The only thing left to do was accept it. Application in life. When things don't go your way, ask yourself, am I resisting what cannot be changed? Let go of the struggle and focus on what you can do next. Lesson to remember. Peace comes not from controlling life, but from accepting it as it is. The monk smiled. Shall we continue? Part 8. Find strength in letting go. The young man shifted on the bench, his mind still lingering on the lesson of acceptance. The old monk noticed his contemplation and gently continued. There is a difference, the monk said, between acceptance and letting go. Acceptance is understanding what is. Letting go is freeing yourself from attachment to it. The young man listened carefully as the monk began his story. Many years ago, I had a beautiful wooden statue of the Buddha. It was carved by my teacher and given to me as a gift. I cherished it deeply. Every morning, I would wipe it clean, ensuring no dust settled on its surface. I placed it in a special corner of my room, treating it with great reverence. He paused, his voice softening. One day, while cleaning, I accidentally knocked it over. The statue fell to the ground and shattered. The young man gasped. That must have been painful. The monk nodded. For a moment, I felt a deep sadness. But then I asked myself, was it truly the statue I cherished, or the meaning I had attached to it? The Buddha's wisdom was still in my heart. The loss of the object did not take that away. The young man's expression changed as understanding dawned on him. That was the day I learned. The monk said, that attachment is what causes suffering. When we cling to things, whether objects, relationships, or expectations, we give them power over our peace. Letting go does not mean not caring. It means loving without clinging, holding without grasping. Application in life. Ask yourself, what am I holding on to that is causing me suffering? A grudge, a fear, an expectation. Letting go is not losing. It is making space for peace. Lesson to remember. True strength is not in holding on, but in knowing when to let go. The monk smiled. Are you ready for the next lesson? Part 9. Make self-care a priority. The young man sat quietly, reflecting on the lesson of letting go. The old monk let the silence settle before continuing. Many people believe that to be virtuous, one must always put others first. The monk said, but tell me, if a lamp runs out of oil, how can it continue to give light? The young man thought for a moment. It can't, he admitted. The monk nodded. That is why self-care is not selfish. It is necessary. He began his story. Years ago, when I was a young monk, I dedicated all my time to serving others. I woke before sunrise, spent the day teaching, helping villagers, tending to the monastery. I rarely rested. I thought this was the way of compassion. The monk sighed, recalling the past. One day, my body grew weak. My mind became clouded. I could no longer focus during meditation. I had given so much that I had nothing left to give. The young man's eyes widened. What did you do? My teacher found me and said, a river that gives water to others must also replenish itself. Rest, eat well, and care for your mind. Only then can you truly help others. The monk smiled. I learned that taking care of myself, through proper rest, mindful eating, and moments of solitude, allowed me to serve with more energy, more clarity, and more love. Application in life. Prioritize your well-being. Take time to rest, nourish your body, and find moments of stillness. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Lesson to remember. Caring for yourself is not selfish. It is how you continue to care for others. The monk met the young man's gaze. Now, for the final lesson, Part 10. Harness the power of gratitude. The young man sat up straighter, sensing that the final lesson would be an important one. The old monk took a deep breath, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of many years. Of all the lessons I have learned, the monk said, gratitude is the most powerful. The young man tilted his head. Why? The monk smiled. Because gratitude transforms everything. It turns what we have into enough. It turns hardships into lessons. It turns life itself into a gift. He began his story. When I was younger, I once traveled through a village struck by drought. The land was dry. The crops had withered, and the people had little food. Yet, I met an old woman who welcomed me with a warm smile. She offered me a small bowl of rice, the last bit of food she had. I hesitated, but she insisted. The young man frowned. Why would she do that if she had so little? I asked her the same. The monk said, and she replied, because I am grateful. I have lived a long life. I have seen many sunrises. I have love in my heart. And today, I have the chance to share. The monk paused, letting the words settle. That was the moment I realized. Gratitude is not about having everything. It is about seeing the value in what we already have. The young man's expression softened. Application in life. Every day, take a moment to reflect on what you are grateful for, not just the big things, but the small ones. A kind word, a warm meal, the breath in your lungs. Lesson to remember. Gratitude does not change what we have. It changes how we see it. And that changes everything. The monk smiled. Now, my child, tell me, what have you learned? The path to true peace. The young man sat in silence, his heart and mind full from the wisdom he had just received. The old monk watched him with a gentle smile, allowing him a moment to reflect. Finally, the young man spoke. I think I understand, now. Peace is not something we find outside of ourselves. It is something we create within. The monk nodded. Yes, we cannot control what others say or do. We cannot stop the storms of life, but we can control how we respond. And when we master that, nothing can disturb our peace. The young man took a deep breath. Master these lessons. They are simple, yet powerful. But what if I forget? What if I struggle to apply them? The monk chuckled. That is why we practice, my child. Even, I must remind myself, every day. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars had begun to appear. Life will continue to test you. People will insult you. Challenges will arise. But now, you know the way forward. The young man smiled. Yes, when someone insults me, I will not take their words personally. When I face difficulties, I will see them as lessons. And when life does not go as I wish, I will accept and let go. The monk placed a hand on his shoulder. And most importantly, be grateful. Gratitude turns every moment into a gift. Even this one. The young man looked around. The night air was cool. The temple bells chimed softly in the distance, and the warmth of wisdom filled his heart. He felt lighter, stronger, at peace. He bowed deeply. Thank you, Master. I will carry these lessons with me. The monk smiled. Good. Now, go and live them. As the young man walked down the stone steps, disappearing into the night, the monk closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Another soul had begun the journey toward true peace. Reflection for you. Now, dear listener, ask yourself, which lesson resonated with you the most? Have you ever struggled with anger, attachment, or expectations? How have you overcome them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's create a space for wisdom and reflection. If this story brought you peace, like, share, and subscribe to continue receiving stories of Buddhist wisdom. Remember, true peace begins within. Let us all walk this path together.